Chapter 7. Kit arrived at the station on a Tuesday afternoon with a document in a Tyvek sleeve and an expression that suggested they had been rehearsing what they were going to say for approximately 12 years and were still not satisfied with the opening line. Des heard the car, not Kit's car because Kit didn't own one, but what she'd come to recognize as Ginny Calloway's borrowed Subaru, a vehicle Kit had apparently earned borrowing privileges for through a sustained campaign of being the kind of person town officials trusted with their vehicles. The engine cut. A door opened and closed with the careful pressure of someone who treated other people's things with the same tenderness they applied to 100-year-old ledgers. Footsteps on gravel, then on concrete, then the main door, which Des had propped open with a cinder block because the station's ventilation was theoretical, and she'd been soldering for 3 hours, and the fumes had opinions. "You're soldering," Kit said from the hallway. Not a greeting, an observation delivered in the specific tone of a person cataloging the scene. "I'm improving the ground connection on the secondary receiver." Des pushed her safety glasses up onto her forehead and turned from the workbench she'd set up in the equipment room. Harriet's room, the cold room, the one that was always 10 degrees below the rest of the building, in a way that had nothing to do with insulation and everything to do with something Des had decided not to think about until she had more data. The original solder joints are fine, better than fine, actually. Whoever did this was precise. But there's corrosion at the junction points where copper meets the chassis, and that's introducing resistance into the signal path. It's like trying to hear someone through a wall that's gotten thicker over time. "Through a wall," Kit repeated. Their voice did the thing, the gravity shift, the pulling down, the way certain phrases acquired additional mass when Kit said them. They were standing in the doorway of the equipment room, the Tyvek sleeve held in both hands, the way a person holds something that is either very fragile or very important, or both. Des set down the soldering iron. "What is that?" "This," Kit said, "is the thing I told you about. At the anchor. The parallel record. The thing you found in 1947. The thing Harriet wrote outside the official logs. A page of personal notes, handwritten, separate from the broadcast volumes. I found it in the library's uncatalogued collection, my first year here. It was in a box of miscellaneous Coast Guard paperwork that someone donated in the 70s, probably without reading it, because if they'd read it, they would not have put it in a box with procurement forms and tide charts." Kit entered the room. The air shifted the way it always did when Kit was in the station. A settling, a tuning, as if the building recognized the person who had pressed their ear against its door at 9 years old and had been listening ever since. Des felt it in her chest, the baseline hum dropping a quarter tone, the static in the walls thinning to something almost musical. She'd documented this effect over the past week. She documented it because she was a producer, and documentation was reflex. And because if she documented the effect of Kit's presence on the station's frequency, she could treat it as data instead of as the other thing it was, which was that Kit Nakamura walking into a room changed the quality of the air in a way Des didn't have technical language for and wasn't ready to name. Kit set the Tyvek sleeve on the workbench and opened it with archivist's hands, the specific, unhurried precision of someone who had spent 12 years handling documents that were older and more fragile than most people's certainties. Inside was a single page, unlined paper, slightly yellowed with creased fold marks that suggested it had lived in someone's pocket for a long time before being smoothed and stored. Des recognized it immediately. The controlled rightward slant, the heavy downstrokes, the engineered precision of a woman who wrote the way she built circuits, deliberately, with every line carrying current. But this handwriting was different from the broadcast logs. The letters were larger, less careful. The pen had pressed harder in some places and barely touched in others. The way handwriting changes when a person stops writing for the record and starts writing for themselves. When the audience shifts from institutional to personal. When the words stop being documentation and start being a message. Read it aloud, Kit said. They said it quietly, and the quietness had the quality not of hesitation, but of reverence. The way you speak in a place that has earned your respect. I've read it 100 times to myself. I want to hear someone else's voice say the words. Des picked up the page. Her hands were steady, the hands that held microphones and adjusted frequency knobs, and wrapped cable with the absent precision of muscle memory. But somewhere beneath the steadiness, in the place where her body registered information before her mind processed it, something was vibrating. The page was warm. Not body warm, not ambient warm, but warm the way the console was warm, with a heat that had no source she could identify, and a frequency she could feel in her fingertips like a pulse. She read, October 3rd, 1947. Tonight, I heard her again. Dez's voice in the equipment room was different from her voice in other rooms. She'd noticed this her first week. The acoustics of the station did something to sound that she couldn't quite diagram. The broadcast room was warm and resonant, the kind of room that made voices sound richer, deeper, more present, as if the walls were designed to hold the human voice the way a concert hall holds an orchestra. The equipment room was the opposite. Cold, close, the sound dying fast against the concrete walls, except that it didn't. Her voice should have been flat in here, dead. Instead, it carried, as if the room were channeling it somewhere, amplifying it through systems she couldn't see. She was clearer tonight than she has ever been. I adjusted the resonance coil, replaced the capacitor, increased the coupling, and when I tuned past the third harmonic, the static dropped and she was there. Not fragments, not the shape of words. Words. Kit was watching her read. Des could feel it, the quality of Kit's attention, the full body focus, the way Kit listened with the same intensity Des did, but with a patience Des lacked. Des listened like she was chasing something. Kit listened like something was arriving. She said, "Can you hear me?" And I said, "Yes." I don't know if it works both ways. I don't know if she heard me back. But I said it. That's something. Des stopped. The room was silent. Not the empty silence of a vacant building, but the held silence of a building that was paying attention. The silence of a system that was processing input and waiting to see what happened next. Keep reading, Kit said. Like hearing someone through a wall. Not the words, the shape of the words, the wanting in them. That's the closest I can come. It's not static, and it's not signal, and it's not any classification I learned at MIT. It's a voice, and it wants to be heard. The page trembled in Dez's hands. Not because Dez's hands were trembling, they weren't, but because the page itself seemed to be vibrating at a frequency just below perceptible, as if the handwriting were still moving, still writing, the message still being composed 75 years later by a woman whose hands Des had felt through copper coils, and whose grief Des had inherited, and whose obsession Des was beginning to understand not as madness, but as clarity. The specific, terrible clarity of a person who had heard something that shouldn't exist, and had made the only rational choice possible, which was to listen harder. I'm going to keep trying, Des read, the last line, the closing, the summation of a woman's commitment. I'm going to keep adjusting the equipment, keep documenting, keep speaking into the static. If she can hear me, I want her to know someone is listening. If she can't, then at least I will have tried. At least the trying is something. Des set the page down. The room held its breath. In the silence, she could hear the building's hum, the one she'd learned to listen through all the other sounds, the baseline frequency that lived in the walls and the floor and the place where concrete met bedrock. The station's heartbeat. Harriet's heartbeat. Still resonating 80 years later through equipment that should not be functioning and spaces that should not be holding this kind of weight. She had data, Des said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that was arriving fully formed, the way all her best realizations arrived, through listening. She documented everything: the frequency ranges where the signal was strongest, the equipment adjustments that improved reception, the weather conditions that affected clarity. She approached it like an engineer. Like a producer, Kit said. Like someone who understood that signals required attention, and attention required systems, and systems required care. You have data, Kit said, and the ghost of the quarter smile was back, and the word data in Kit's mouth sounded like something between gratitude and affection, as if being offered data was being offered something intimate. They began. The system they developed over the next 3 hours was the product of two minds that worked in complementary frequencies. Dez's instinct for sound and signal, Kit's instinct for documentation and pattern. Dez operated the equipment, the main console, the secondary receiver, the Zoom F6 running continuous capture on 4 channels. Kit documented: a legal pad, a pencil, timestamps in the margin, observations in the careful shorthand they'd developed over 12 years of annotating the history of a building that shouldn't be making the sounds it was making. They established a protocol. Des would tune through the frequency range Harriet had identified, the range between 71.3 kilohertz and 72.8 kilohertz, that didn't correspond to any allocated broadcast band and shouldn't have contained anything but thermal noise and atmospheric scatter. Kit would record observations: time, frequency position, signal strength, estimated by Des on a 1 to 5 scale, content description, duration. Between sweeps, they would pause, compare notes, adjust. The October light, through the west-facing windows, moved across the broadcast room floor in a long, gold parallelogram that tracked the afternoon's progress, from productive to orange to the specific shade of amber that meant the sun was filtering through the fog bank that had been sitting on the horizon all day like something patient. The console hummed. The secondary receiver hummed. The building hummed. The three sources were distinct. Des could separate them now, could hear the main console's electrical hum, 120 hertz, transformer sourced, normal, and the secondary receiver's deeper tone, somewhere around 40 hertz, sourced by nothing she could identify, emphatically not normal, and the building itself, which produced a vibration less heard than felt, a subsonic presence that lived in the floor and the walls and registered in the body as a pressure, a warmth, a sense of being inside something that was alive in a way that buildings were not supposed to be. Kit documented everything. Des watched them work, peripherally, the way you watch something in your visual field while your primary attention is on the equipment, the way a producer watches the clock while listening to a take. Kit sat at the operator's desk, the legal pad angled precisely, the pencil moving in strokes that were fast but never careless. Their glasses caught the amber light. The corduroy jacket was draped over the back of the chair. They'd taken it off an hour ago, and underneath was a dark green Henley that Des noticed and did not examine the noticing of. The first signal came through at 4:47 p.m. It arrived the way all signals arrived at the station: a shift in the static, a thinning, as if the white noise were a curtain being drawn aside to reveal the sound behind it. Des's hands found the tuning knob, the warm brass knob, Harriet's knob, the one that turned with a smoothness no 70-year-old mechanism should possess, and adjusted, and the signal clarified. A voice. Fragment. 3 syllables that might have been a word in a language Des didn't recognize, or might have been a word in English, distorted by the layers of noise it had traveled through to reach her. Then static. Then silence. Then the hum, steady and patient. The carrier wave saying, "I'm still here. Keep listening." 4:47, Kit said. The pencil moved. Signal strength? 2, maybe 2.5. Short duration, possible vocal content. Frequency? 71.8. right in the middle of Harriet's range. They looked at each other. Kit's eyes behind the glasses were dark and bright, and held an expression that Des was beginning to catalog as Kit's version of contained exhilaration, the look of a person who had just received evidence that confirmed a hypothesis they'd been holding for 28 years, and who was managing this confirmation with the scholarly composure of someone who understood that evidence required verification and replication, and was also, underneath all of that, electrified. Again, Kit said. Des turned back to the console. She adjusted the tuning, swept the frequency range. The static rose and fell like breath, and she listened with her whole body, the thing that had cost her Marcus and her career and her sleep, and had brought her here, to this console, in this building, with this person who documented the impossible with a pencil and a legal pad, and a patience that made Des feel, for the first time in months, like she wasn't listening alone. The second signal was stronger. It came at 5:03, 16 minutes later, as if the station were establishing a rhythm, finding its broadcast pace. The static thinned, the hum deepened, and through the speakers, clear enough to make Dez's hands grip the console's edge, a voice, female, a full sentence, or most of one, the beginning lost in static, but the rest arriving with a clarity that sent the meters on the Zoom F6 jumping. Can you hear me? I've been static. 5:03, Kit said. Their voice was level. Their pencil was not. It hovered above the pad, suspended, the stillness of a hand that had forgotten to move because the brain was processing something too large for habitual action. 4. Dez's voice was steady. She was proud of that. Her hands were trembling on the console. That was a 4. That was the clearest signal since Kit. That was clearer than anything I've gotten alone. The noise floor is lower. The signal is stronger. Since you arrived, the signal to noise has been better. Significantly better. This is... She stopped. The producer's brain was calculating. 3 weeks of solo recordings, all of them fragmentary. Signal strength between 1 and 3 on her improvised scale. 3 hours of working with Kit, and the signal had jumped to a 4. The variable that had changed was Kit's presence. The variable she hadn't wanted to name. This is the best reception I've had, by a meaningful margin. Kit set the pencil down. They placed it on the pad with the precise, ceremonial care of someone completing a gesture that they needed to complete before they could process what was happening. Then they looked at Des, and their face held the expression that Des was running out of ways to not identify. The complicated, layered, 13 years of lonely listening thing that was hope and fear and the specific courage of a person standing on the edge of the thing they'd been working toward their whole life. It responds to both of us, Kit said. Together. That's what Harriet couldn't achieve alone. The console hummed. The secondary receiver hummed. The building hummed. And in the spaces between the hums, in the frequency where silence should have lived, Des could hear it. Not a voice, not yet, but the architecture of a voice, the channel clearing, the noise floor dropping, the signal path opening like a door between one room and the next. Kit picked up the pencil. Des turned back to the console. The October light shifted from amber to gold to the long horizontal red of sunset filtering through the fog. And they worked, and the station hummed around them. And somewhere in the static, a voice was forming that had been waiting 80 years for two people in the same room to listen together. They didn't leave until dark. They didn't notice the dark arriving.